My name is Sarah. I am 28 years old, and my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird the moment I slipped that pale blue envelope onto the heavy mahogany desk. I left a love letter on my boss's desk. The office was completely empty, bathed in the cold blue light of the street lamps filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows of downtown Seattle, and the silence of the 14th floor was absolutely deafening. My hands were shaking so violently that I nearly knocked over his expensive silver pen holder as I positioned the letter precisely in the center of his leather blotting pad. Inside that envelope was my very soul, poured out onto 3 pages of ink, confessing every hidden feeling, every stolen glance, and every late night we spent working together that I had desperately convinced myself meant something more. I breathed in the faint, familiar scent of his cedarwood cologne that always lingered in his office, feeling a dizzying, intoxicating mix of pure terror and absolute euphoria, believing with every fiber of my being that this was the start of our real story.
I went home that night and barely slept a single second, staring wide-eyed at my bedroom ceiling, imagining his reaction, imagining him rushing to find me the next morning to tell me he felt the exact same way. But the next day, the office was quiet. He was nowhere to be found. And suddenly, my cell phone buzzed with an unknown number. And when I answered, a woman's voice, terrifyingly calm and steady, spoke through the receiver. It was his wife. And she said, "It all started 2 years earlier when I was first hired as a junior graphic designer at one of the most prestigious and demanding architectural firms in the entire city. I was fresh out of college, carrying a massive burden of student debt, and armed with a portfolio I had spent countless sleepless nights perfecting, but I was completely unprepared for the relentless, high-stakes environment of the corporate world. The office was a sprawling, modern labyrinth of glass walls, polished concrete floors, and a constant buzzing energy that made my stomach churn with a heavy mixture of excitement and sheer terror every single morning when I walked through the front doors. I felt like a complete imposter, a small, insignificant fish in an ocean of sharks who all seemed to know exactly what they were doing and where they were going. I spent my first few weeks hiding behind my dual computer monitors, terrified of making even the smallest mistake, terrified of speaking up in the large conference meetings, terrified of simply being noticed and found utterly lacking in talent. And then there was my boss. His name was David, a distinguished and incredibly commanding man of 42 years old who possessed an effortless, quiet authority that instantly controlled the room the second he walked through the heavy glass doors. He was the kind of man who didn't ever need to raise his voice to be heard, wearing impeccably tailored suits, but always keeping his sleeves rolled up, a subtle signal that he was a hard worker who wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty alongside his team. From the very first day, I was both deeply intimidated and completely mesmerized by him. I was struggling with a highly complex digital rendering late one Tuesday evening, feeling the hot sting of frustrated tears prickling the corners of my eyes when David pulled up a chair right next to my desk. I remember the exact smell of his black coffee mixing with that cedarwood cologne. He didn't belittle me. He didn't sigh in annoyance at my lack of experience. Instead, he patiently explained the software shortcut, his deep, resonant voice calming the frantic anxiety that had been choking me all day. He looked at my work, genuinely smiled, and told me I had a brilliant eye for detail. In that massive, cold, and hyper-competitive office, he made me feel seen. He made me feel valuable. And looking back now, I realized that feeling of being seen by someone so important, so powerful, was the dangerous drug that started my entire downward spiral. The mentorship continued over the next several months, and slowly, without me even realizing it, my profound professional admiration began to morph into a quiet, consuming obsession. I stopped going out on dates. I stopped meeting my friends on the weekends. My entire world, my entire emotional spectrum, shrank down to the dimensions of the 14th floor of that office building. I would wake up an hour earlier than necessary just to meticulously pick out an outfit, hoping it was something he might notice when he walked past my cubicle. I began analyzing his emails with the intensity of a scholar, trying to find hidden meanings in the simplest corporate correspondence. If he used an exclamation mark, I convinced myself he was genuinely excited to talk to me. If he handed me a file and his fingers brushed against mine for a fraction of a second, my heart would race for the next 3 hours. It was absolute madness, a total departure from reality.
but in my lonely, stressed out mind, it felt so incredibly real and beautiful. The only person who saw through my pathetic facade was my best friend and coworker, Jessica, a sharp-witted and pragmatic woman of 29 years old who sat in the desk directly opposite mine. Jessica didn't miss a single thing that happened in that office. One rainy afternoon, we were sitting in a crowded deli down the street, eating cheap sandwiches on our lunch break, when she finally looked at me, put her sandwich down, and dropped the heavy bomb of reality. She told me I needed to stop looking at David like a starving dog looking at a steak. She leaned across the small table, her eyes filled with genuine concern, and said the words that should have woken me up.
She said he is married, Sarah. He's 42 years old, and you are going to destroy your career if you keep staring at him like that. I felt a hot, defensive flush of anger spread across my chest and up my neck. I immediately defended him, and I fiercely defended myself. I told her she was completely crazy, that she didn't understand the unique unspoken connection we had, that he was just a brilliant mentor. But deep down, I knew she was right about my feelings. Yet the arrogance of my own delusion made me double down instead of pulling back. I started inventing a tragic romantic narrative in my head to justify my inappropriate feelings. I had seen a framed picture of his wife on his desk once, a beautiful woman smiling on a beach, but I convinced myself their smiles looked strained and distant. Whenever David worked late, which was often, I told myself it was because he dreaded going home to a cold, loveless marriage. I built an entire, elaborate fantasy in my head where he was a deeply lonely man, suffering in silence, just waiting for someone young, passionate, and understanding like me to save him from his miserable existence.
I was projecting all of my own loneliness and desire onto a man who was simply trying to do his job. The ultimate catalyst for my catastrophic mistake arrived during a major pitch for a downtown luxury hotel project. The deadline was absolutely brutal, requiring 3 solid weeks of sleeping under our desks, eating stale vending machine snacks, and staring at screens until our eyes burned. The tension in the office was thick and suffocating. People were snapping at each other in the hallways, and the air was heavy with stress. The David and I were working closely together, a small team in the trenches, and the intense proximity completely short-circuited my rational brain. It was a late Friday night, the deadline looming on Monday morning. Everyone else had gone home utterly exhausted. The cleaning staff had already done their rounds and left. The low, constant hum of the computer servers was the only sound in the massive empty office. We ordered greasy takeout from a cheap Thai place down the block and sat together in the large glass-walled conference room, spreading the food containers over the scattered blueprints.
He looked so incredibly tired, rubbing his eyes constantly, the dark circles under them prominent under the harsh fluorescent lights. As we ate, the conversation naturally shifted away from the hotel project and drifted into personal territory. He started talking, his voice low and vulnerable, about how he felt the years were slipping away from him so fast, how the relentless pressure of the industry was making him lose his creative spark. He was simply expressing the fatigue of a demanding career, maybe a touch of a midlife crisis, but my delusional mind interpreted his words as a profound confession of a broken heart. I thought he was subtly telling me that his life was empty without me in it. And then, the fatal, tragic moment occurred. He stood up to stretch, walked over to where I was sitting, placed his large, warm hand firmly on my shoulder, squeezed it gently, and looked down at me. He said he couldn't possibly do this project without me, Sarah, that I was incredibly special and talented. The warmth of his hand burned right through the fabric of my sweater, sending a massive electric shock straight to my heart. I completely, fatally misread the situation. I mistook a gesture of tired, grateful professional camaraderie for a burning declaration of repressed love. That entire weekend was pure, unadulterated agony. I couldn't eat a single bite of food. I couldn't focus on the television or read a book. I just paced back and forth across the small wooden floor of my apartment, obsessively replaying the exact pressure of his fingers on my shoulder, analyzing the specific tone of his voice when he called me special. I convinced myself with absolute certainty that his words were a coded plea. I reasoned that he was an honorable married man. He couldn't possibly make the first move and risk everything without knowing how I felt. He needed me to be brave for both of us. He needed me to break the ice. By Sunday night, as the Seattle rain lashed violently against my bedroom window, the overwhelming urge to confess became a physical pressure in my chest that I could no longer contain. I sat down at my small kitchen table with a stack of expensive, pale blue stationery I had bought years ago and never used.
I started writing. I ruined 5 different drafts because my hands were shaking and my tears kept smudging the black ink.
I poured out every hidden feeling, every interpreted sign, offering myself completely and unconditionally. I wrote about our profound connection. I wrote that I knew he was unhappy in his life. I wrote that I was entirely willing to wait for him, that I loved him with everything I had, and that I knew he felt the same way. It was the most vulnerable, raw, and tragically foolish document ever created by a human being. Monday was a living nightmare of anticipation. I walked into the office with that blue envelope burning a hole in the bottom of my leather bag. I couldn't focus on my work at all. My stomach was tied in agonizing knots, and I felt like I was going to throw up every time David walked past my desk. I waited patiently, watching the clock tick agonizingly slowly. I waited until 6 o'clock, then 7. Finally, by 8 o'clock in the evening, the floor was entirely empty, the lights dimming automatically. I took a massive, shuddering breath, clutching the envelope so tightly my knuckles turned white, and walked down the long carpeted corridor toward his corner office. His door was unlocked. I stepped inside, the air feeling heavy and charged. I placed the letter right on the dead center of his desk, precisely where he couldn't possibly miss it the next morning. The walk back to the elevator felt like I was floating on air. I was terrified, yes, but I also felt incredibly alive, powerful, and triumphant. I had finally taken control of my destiny. The drive home was a complete blur of euphoric anticipation, my mind racing with beautiful fantasies of how he would pull me into an empty room the next day and finally kiss me. But Tuesday morning brought a reality check so violent it nearly destroyed me. I arrived early, my heart pounding so hard in my throat I could barely swallow. I waited for the heavy glass doors to swing open, fully expecting David to walk in, lock eyes with me, and give me a secret knowing sign. But 9 o'clock passed, then 10 o'clock. His office remained completely dark and empty. He wasn't answering emails. The euphoric high from the night before rapidly crashed into a suffocating deep pit of dark anxiety. I kept looking over at Jessica, who was typing away happily, completely unaware that my entire world was hanging by a thread. At exactly 11 in the morning, my cell phone vibrated violently on my desk. It wasn't an internal office call. It was an unknown Seattle number. I answered it, my voice trembling so much it cracked. "Sarah, this is Emily, David's wife." The entire world literally stopped spinning. The air was violently sucked out of the room. A cold, clammy sweat broke out across my forehead, and a wave of nausea hit me so incredibly hard I had to grip the edge of my desk with both hands just to stop myself from falling out of my chair. Emily, a strikingly elegant woman of 40 years old, didn't sound like a furious, betrayed, screaming wife. Her voice was terrifyingly calm, almost gentle, which made the situation 1,000 times worse than if she had been screaming. She asked if I could step out of the office right now and meet her at a coffee shop 3 blocks down the street. I managed to whisper a weak agreement. I stood up, feeling like my legs were made of heavy lead, and walked slowly out of the building. The Seattle drizzle felt like freezing ice against my burning, flushed skin. The walk to the cafe felt like a slow march to my own execution. The coffee shop was crowded, loud, and smelled strongly of roasted beans and damp wool coats. I spotted her immediately, sitting in a corner booth. Emily was radiating an effortless, mature elegance that made me feel instantly small, messy, and incredibly childish. She wore a perfectly tailored trench coat and held a warm cup of tea with manicured hands. Just looking at her, looking at the reality of his actual life, the entire pathetic fantasy I had built began to crumble into dust. I sat down across from her, my hand shaking in my lap. I couldn't even meet her eyes. Right there, sitting in the middle of the small wooden table between us, was my pale blue envelope. It had been opened. The silence between us stretched for what felt like an absolute eternity. The ambient noise of the cafe, the grinding espresso machines, the chatter of people, faded into a dull, rushing roar in my ears. I wanted the floor to open up and swallow me whole. I wanted to disappear from the face of the earth. Emily finally spoke, taking a small sip of her tea. She didn't yell, she didn't throw the coffee in my face. Instead, she dismantled my entire universe with quiet,
devastating, surgical precision. She told me that David hadn't hidden the letter. He hadn't kept it a secret. He had brought it straight home to her the night before, in a state of absolute frantic panic and bewilderment. He was completely horrified. He didn't understand where this had come from, and he was deeply concerned for my mental state. The humiliation was a physical, sharp agony, like shattered glass tearing through my chest. Emily carefully explained that David saw me as a talented kid, a junior employee he was trying to mentor because my ambition reminded him of himself when he was young. He never had a single romantic thought about me, never. Every lingering look I thought I saw, every late-night conversation, the touch on my shoulder, it was all entirely innocent, basic professional courtesy. I had hallucinated an epic, sweeping love affair out of basic human kindness. Then came the final crushing blow. Emily looked at me not with anger, but with profound, devastating pity. She said David was too embarrassed and deeply uncomfortable to ever face me again. The professional trust was irreparably, permanently broken. He didn't want to fire me officially because he didn't want to ruin my resume or my future career, but he absolutely could not work in the same building with me anymore.
She softly suggested that it would be best for everyone, especially for my own remaining dignity, if I walked back up to the office, packed my personal things quietly, and sent an immediate resignation email to the HR department. She slid the pale blue envelope across the wooden table back to me. "Don't ruin your life over a fantasy, Sarah," she said quietly, before standing up, buttoning her coat, and walking out into the cold rain, leaving me alone with my shattered illusion. I sat there in that booth for over an hour, staring blankly at the letter. The profound realization of my own severe delusion was absolutely crushing. I wasn't the beautiful star of a tragic romance. I was the creepy, boundary-crossing subordinate who had made her boss intensely uncomfortable in his own workplace. The deep pain of the unrequited love was completely and utterly eclipsed by the blinding, suffocating shame of my own actions. The walk back to the office was a silent death march. I grabbed an empty cardboard box from the supply room, keeping my head down. Jessica saw me packing. She rushed over, her face pale, asking frantically what was wrong, asking why I was crying so hard I couldn't even breathe. I couldn't even formulate the words to explain the depth of my humiliation. I just shook my head, avoiding her concerned eyes, packed my keyboard, my coffee mugs, my framed photos, and walked out of those heavy glass doors for the last time, leaving my dream job behind in ruins. The next few weeks were undoubtedly the darkest, most painful period of my entire life. I locked myself inside my small apartment. I didn't shower for days. I barely ate enough to survive. The depression was absolute and heavy. I was mourning the loss of a man who never actually loved me, mourning the loss of a career I had worked so hard to build, and most importantly, mourning the loss of my own sanity and self-respect. I hated myself with a burning passion for being so incredibly naive, so incredibly arrogant to think that a few kind words meant true love. Slowly, painfully, over the course of several months, the basic human survival instinct finally kicked in. The rent was due and my savings were running out. I had to force myself to get out of bed. I updated my resume, staring blankly at the 2-year gap that ended so abruptly and mysteriously. The interview process at other firms was utterly terrifying. I lived in constant, paralyzing fear that someone would call David for a reference and discover the humiliating, pathetic truth of why I really left. Eventually, I managed to find a new job at a much smaller, far less prestigious firm on the other side of Seattle. I became a completely different person there. I built massive, impenetrable emotional walls around myself. I kept every single interaction strictly, coldly professional. I never went to lunch with coworkers, and I absolutely never worked late alone with a male colleague. I learned the incredibly hard way that the workplace is not a romance novel, and that profound loneliness can make you see beautiful mirages in a barren desert. Healing from that level of humiliation took years of painful self-reflection. Even now, I still cringe physically, my stomach tying in knots whenever I see a piece of pale blue paper. The pain of unrequited love is a very unique, specific kind of grief, because you are essentially mourning a ghost. You are mourning a beautiful future that only ever existed inside your own head.
I had to learn to forgive myself for desperately seeking love in all the wrong places, and to finally understand the brutal, necessary difference between someone simply being kind to you and someone actually being yours. Looking back at that devastating chapter of my life, I realize how incredibly blinding loneliness can truly be. If you were desperate, isolated, and completely blinded by a beautiful fantasy that offered an escape from your own insecurities, would you have made the same catastrophic mistake in my place? Until the next story.